A lot for us to dig into. MSNBC senior national security reporter David Rohde is here on set with me, and thankfully an MSNBC person officially. Mark Leibovich, staff writer at The Atlantic. He's also an MSNBC political contributor. And Barbara McQuade, a former U.S. attorney and professor at the University of Michigan Law School. She's also an MSNBC legal analyst, pros one and all. David, I'll come to you first. Just walk us through what we could expect from Comey today.
Was mentioned already, but it's a motion that will argue that the prosecution of Comey is selective and vindictive. The selective part is that has anyone else faced a charge like this? Is it really unprecedented or not? And vindictive, and this is the interesting part, in a sense, politically, the extraordinary role of Donald Trump publicly calling for these charges to be brought. The fact that the career prosecutors in the Eastern District of Virginia, as far as we've been told, didn't feel there was enough of a case here to bring it. He then ousts one person there and then brings in his former personal attorney, Lindsay Halligan. So that's what we expect. And, we don't know how the judge in the case will rule. And even if the judge rules one way or another, this can be appealed and go to a higher court. Yeah, so it's likely just the first chapter in a very long book that we're going to see written here in regards to Comey. But Barb, what do you see as the potential strength of these claims that the prosecution was vindictive? That's one that is typically hard to succeed on the merits of. But in this instance, it does feel like it has a point. And then the other piece of it, which is that Halligan herself not only has no prosecutorial experience, but they're charging that potentially she's in her role illegally. And thusly, that could erode the legitimacy of this case even further, right? Talk to us about what you see here.
Yes, vindictive prosecution can be very difficult to prove because prosecutors enjoy an enormous amount of discretion under our constitutional separation of powers. Ordinarily, it comes in a case where prosecutors say, because you exercise your right to appeal, we're going to crack down and bring more serious charges against you. So it is retaliating against someone for exercising a known legal right. The theory Jim Comey has here is a little bit novel, which is, the right he was exercising was just the right to do his job or to speak out. It's a little bit separate from the rest of the case. And so this one might be an uphill battle. But the appointment issue, I think, is a very strong argument. There are three ways a U.S. attorney can be appointed. One way is with Senate confirmation. Another way is through the Federal Vacancies Reform Act, which allows the appointment of somebody who's either been presidentially appointed and Senate confirmed to some other position or has been serving in that agency for 90 days, or through the interim process where someone gets to serve for 120 days. Lindsay Halligan meets none of those qualifications. They already had their go at the 120-day interim with Eric Siebert. And so because there is no path for appointment, I think there's a very strong argument here that Halligan's appointment is illegal. We're going to hear arguments about that in the Third Circuit Court of Appeals today regarding Alina Habba, and that may give us some insights. But of course, this case is pending in the Fourth Circuit as opposed to the Third Circuit, so we could see different outcomes there.
Yeah, and we're going to circle back to the Alina Habba of it all because that is percolating in the background. But Mark, what are you watching for from Comey's defense and from this case more broadly? Because we started our last hour talking about how this is happening in the court of law, but it's very much a case of public opinion and court of public opinion as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, before we get to the Ali Habba of it all, I love that phrase. I do think that, look, I mean, the legal parts of this are complicated. They're multi-layered, and I don't pretend to have any of the authority that anyone else on this air right now has. But I do think that the crux of this is not so much the selective prosecution, but this is playing out in a way that we have never seen before, which is a president of the United States not whispering his enemies list at all. I mean, basically being extremely public, extremely fulsome about who he wants punished, and basically that going directly everywhere, but also directly to the Justice Department, to the FBI, and what have you. And this is, it seems to be a central part of his narrative. I mean, punishing his enemies. I think at some point, this will probably play out in a lot of different courts over a long period of time. But you do sort of have to wonder, what is the political benefit of vindictiveness, of revenge, when you are effectively sort of heading towards lame duck hood and the economy is still in a pretty rough place, and people are obviously want the president and want the Republican Party and want the leaders of Washington to focus on the economy and other issues.
Or even just getting the government started again. You know, maybe that's just me as the senior congressional reporter here, but that's definitely another thing I would add to the list. You know, we've talked about her a few times here, Alina Habba. And David, as we mentioned, the Third Circuit Court of Appeals is hearing arguments now in a case that argues that she, a former Trump attorney, was not lawfully appointed to serve in her new role. So what is the significance of this as it ties into looking at the way we're talking about Lindsay Halligan? Habba's sort of like 4 steps ahead in the legal process on, are you appointed rightfully, lawfully or not?
I think it's not good news for Halligan that the rulings so far about Alina Habba have raised questions about how Trump has been appointing people. And the broader issue is the power of the president. A U.S. attorney across the country, there in every state, has to be approved by the Senate. It's a formal nomination process. It's a key thing, having their review and their consent. And that isn't happening with all these interim appointments. So, you know, and the whole broad, you know, one of the themes of the Trump presidency is increasing presidential power. So it's like so many other issues, this will end up with judges in the courts. So it is very important to see how the ruling is in the Habba case, because it will impact possibly the Comey case as well. Yeah. And just going back in history, one of the ways that the classified documents case was thrown out, this was back in Florida against the special counsel Jack Smith, was that the judge there ruled that Smith had been improperly appointed as a special counsel. So this may seem like a technicality to people, but these rulings can have an enormous impact on these cases. Yeah, foundationally speaking. Yes. So, Barb, when you think about that, what could the domino effect be here if the court finds that Habba wasn't appointed properly? What does that mean for the cases that she has overseen? We've kind of talked about the specter it casts over the Halligan piece, but what about Habba's cases?
Yes, it means that every one of those cases that has been indicted since she took over at that office is null and void. It's the same thing we saw in Florida when Judge Aileen Cannon dismissed the case against Donald Trump, finding that the special counsel had been inappropriately appointed, contrary to regulations and law and the Constitution. If the person who is overseeing that office was not validly in their job, then every defendant is going to have their case dismissed. Now, it probably includes drug dealers, corrupt public officials, all kinds of cases. Now, they could appoint a new U.S. attorney there to remedy that problem and refile some of those cases, but it could mean a mad scramble for people who are working there. It could also mean that if the statute of limitations has expired in the time from when she took over, those cases may be lost to the interests of justice. It also could be that in the interim, if cases are dismissed, defendants who would otherwise be detained because they're a danger to the public would be released.
It's a really excellent point that you make there, especially about what the domino effect could be for people whose cases were decided in a verdict that felt right for what that case actually was. You know, Mark, there is yet another case that we have been talking about over the course of the last few weeks, and that's John Bolton's indictment, something that the president celebrated in comments yesterday. Watch what he said.
I'm allowed to be involved in this. I'm the Chief Law Enforcement Officer of the United States. You know that, right? A lot of people say, oh, he's the president. He should. No, I'm the Chief Law Enforcement. I'm allowed to be involved in it, but I haven't chosen to. I see John Bolton just got indicted. That's a good thing. He's a bad guy. I don't know what he did, but he's a bad guy. Stupid kind of a guy. I don't know what he did. It must be pretty severe, but whatever it is, let the courts decide.
So, Mark, we've seen the president continue to play this game of he didn't know what was happening, but he's also the chief law enforcement officer of this country. I mean, what does this tell you, to pull on the thread that you talked about earlier? There's no natural political constituency for revenge and retribution. It's not something that others in the Republican Party are going to pick up and run on as an accomplishment. At least I would expect that they wouldn't. And so what does this tell you about how the president sees himself, sees the legacy that he's actively putting together in second term? I mean, what's the point?
It's a good question. It's unclear what he is getting from all this except personal satisfaction. And look, I mean, he obviously, revenge wasn't just a political theme for him in 2024 and even before that. I mean, this is very much at the core of his being and very much at the core of his presidency right now. And look, he probably figures that any political ramifications of this kind of don't matter because he's already won. He's already clear of any legal jeopardy, it seems like. And, why not just inflict as as much pain as you can because he feels he can do it. Again, I don't see or hear a lot of people applauding for this, but it doesn't mean that these charges aren't very serious and a lot of lives aren't being, majorly disrupted through all of this. So again, we'll see. But I mean, I think the answer to this exists very much in the mysteries of Donald Trump's own brain, which we've been all trying to sort of decipher for many, many years now and probably will for decades to come.
Yeah, that's exactly right. You and I were on the campaign trail in 2015 in the early days of the first Trump campaign, and that was the game then, much as it is now. Barb, this allows us to sort of come full circle. Those comments from the president and the way that they could be used in a selective or vindictive prosecution case, does this make it harder for his own prosecutors?
It does. These comments about his being the chief law enforcement officer, that's a very interesting question. Legally, It may be right, but of course, since Watergate, it has been the norm for presidents to stay away and to promote the independence of the Justice Department. But when he makes comments about individuals like John Bolton or James Comey or Letitia James, he is making the job harder for his own prosecutors because they are likely to face motions from the defense that say the president has harmed their right to obtain a fair trial. He has tainted the jury pool. Now, ordinarily, you can cure some of these kinds of things when a high-profile case has been in the news through jury selection by finding people who have not heard much about the case. But when it's the president of the United States, the most powerful person, the most influential person in the country who's making these statements, that taint is going to be stronger than under ordinary circumstances. So I can imagine every prosecutor out there working on these cases are saying to themselves, would he please stop talking? Because every time he opens his mouth to criticize these people, he is creating this due process problem for them.
We begin with a study in contrast. Here are Presidents George W. Bush and President Barack Obama when confronted by public opposition to their policies.
Democracy is a beautiful thing, and that people are allowed to express their opinion. I welcome people's right to say what they believe.
I've listened to you. I heard you. I heard you. I heard you. All right? Now, I've been respectful. I let you holler. All right? So let me nobody's removing you. I've heard you, but you've got to listen to me too.
Believe me, no president likes to see the public turn out in large numbers against them and their agenda. But when it does happen, as you saw there, every one of them understands that it is the people's right to exercise free speech and to criticize their elected leaders at the top of their lungs. And that very thing is what makes America great. That is what makes America America. It's what makes us special all around the world. Until right now. Donald Trump showed the world what he thinks of the American people by literally broadcasting an image of himself pouring feces all over America and the American people. The No Kings protests clearly getting deep under Donald Trump's skin over the weekend. But more importantly, the protests show the contours of a new opposition in America, one led by the people. According to the organizers, 7 million people came out to protest Donald Trump on Saturday. More than 100,000 people marched in New York City. In Chicago, the march at one point stretched 22 blocks. But the protests were hardly confined to big cities in blue states. Here's what the No Kings protests look like in Anchorage, Alaska. Thousands of people taking to the streets. And the protests included people protesting from all walks of life. Here's what a U.S. Army veteran told a reporter at a protest in Oklahoma City.
I was willing to die and lost a leg in a foreign country fighting for their rights. There's no way I'm bending the only knee I have left for a king here in America. I can't sit idly by why rights are trampled on and ignored, and people are pushed and treated like second-class citizens.
Washington Post reports that efforts by Republicans in the last week to smear the protests ahead of the protests fell flat. Quote, Ezra Levin, co-founder of the liberal grassroots movement Indivisible, that has co-organized the No Kings rally, said that RSVPs had skyrocketed. He credited the increased interest in part to the Republicans' rhetoric about the rallies. Protesters told MSNBC in every city we covered that they felt an urgent need to stand up to the Trump administration.
They're not going to intimidate us with tyrant talk. We are out here to stand up for this democracy.
Do not cower to the fascism and the threats that are coming from D.C. That's what they want us to do, and they will only be successful in that if we remain silent.
I'm very much opposed to all of the policies of Donald Trump. I don't think we need a king. We definitely don't need a dictatorship, and it's time for him to go. I am against everything that he says and does.
This is the most American thing that you can do. Protest and speak for what you believe in.
The people who come out here and fight and who want to resist, those are the people who make change. Those are the people who make history. And there are way more, like I said, there are way more of us than there are of them.
We have a constitution for a reason. It provides us inalienable rights that we have to adhere to. And in this country, we have no kings, period.
Millions of Americans rising up to protest Donald Trump is where we start today. Hunter Dunn is back. He's the spokesperson and national press coordinator for the 5051 movement, the organization behind the No Kings protest this weekend. Also joining us, chief political columnist, host of the podcast In Politic for Puck, MSNBC national affairs analyst John Heilman is back. And joining me at the table, Princeton University professor, MSNBC political analyst Eddie Glaude is here. Hunter, I start with you. You and John and I actually spoke around this time Friday ahead of the protest. Tell me what you saw. If anyone was I don't know where you had to be this weekend to miss them. They were literally in every town, in every corner, and coverage has been everywhere. But just give me a summary of what we saw in America over the weekend and tell me if it exceeded your expectations or projections.
Yeah, I was helping organize the protest in downtown Los Angeles, where we had, based on drone footage, well over 100,000 people gathered together and hundreds of thousands more around the county and around the state of California. We saw over 7 million people protest at over 2,700 events around the world in peaceful dissent against Trump's authoritarian power grab, against his regime, against the ICE deportations, against the rise of fascism in this country. And I'm just going to tell you this, I've never seen a coalition this big. We had libertarians and democratic socialists, not just at the same protest, but working together to make it happen. And that is a massive shift from where we have been as a country over the past couple decades.
Hunter, was there any footage that came in as the day went on from any corners or towns that surprised you?
Yeah, well, first off, I was surprised by where we kicked off. It wasn't actually in the U.S. It started in South Korea because their October 18th is earlier than ours. But I saw small protests around the country. So I grew up in Orange County, and an amazing place that I saw was Huntington Beach, California, which is an incredibly red area. I've seen straight up basically Nazi rallies there. So to see a No Kings protest, to see a large turnout of people left, right, and center against this regime, that is a massive shift in what we're saying. And we saw that in small towns around all 50 states, whether it's a red state or a blue state, a red state or a blue city, whether it's rural or urban. We saw a coalition that I don't think we've seen since World War II.
Hunter, we have some reporting here from the NYPD. They tweeted, quote, "The majority of the No Kings protests have been dispersed at this time. All traffic closures have been lifted. We had more than 100,000 people across all 5 boroughs peacefully exercising their First Amendment rights, and the NYPD made 0 protest-related arrests." The story was the same in New York, Austin, San Diego, Charlotte, Portland, according to the police departments. Donald Trump's response was to post an image of himself, thankfully AI generated, but we won't rule anything out at this hour, in an aircraft dumping feces across America and Americans. Even for him, it seemed like a new low. Any response to his reaction to the success of the No Kings protest?
Well, first off, I don't know what was worse, that video or him actually detonating a shell over the I-5. But just a quick recap, there was a ton of different GOP lies about No Kings, right? Democrats will end the shutdown post No Kings. That hasn't happened. Protesters are wildly violent. As you covered, that wasn't true. Protesters are paid. No, they're not. Soros checks are not coming in. I can tell you that much. And no one showed up. That was absolutely not true. We saw over 7 million people come out across the world. The only thing that Trump said or did this entire time that wasn't a lie was him shitting on everyday Americans. And he's been doing that since long before he gained political office.
Donald Trump's government shutdown is now the third longest in American history, and the American people are feeling the shutdown pain more and more each day. Social Security offices are now closing across the country. States are warning of possible disruptions in SNAP benefits, and thousands of federal workers, thousands, folks, and our military families as well are facing immense financial uncertainty. Donald Trump couldn't care less. As the New York Times notes, unlike past presidents, Mr. Trump appears to feel little urgency to strike a deal to reopen the government. Instead, he has used the shutdown as an opportunity to further remake the federal bureaucracy and jettison programs he does not like, programs that impact you, by the way. Joining us now is Jason Johnson, MSNBC political contributor, politics and journalism professor at the Morgan State University, and host of the podcast A Word with Jason Johnson. Sarah Matthews is also back with us.
Look, I'm not surprised that the president is saying he doesn't mind the shutdown. He's the same man. You know, of course he doesn't mind the shutdown. It plays into his authoritarian hands. But every day, every week that this drags on, it's a missed paycheck. It's uncertainty for folks out there. This is what's going on. SNAP payments have been halted in Pennsylvania due to the federal shutdown. Recipients are also reminded that new federally mandated work, education, or volunteer requirements take effect November 1st and must still be reported. I will note that those work requirements are part of that Trump budget bill that passed earlier this year. I will note last year there were around 2 million SNAP recipients in Pennsylvania. That is a lot of people, Jason Johnson.
You know what, though? You know who's not affected? ICE. See, they made sure they can let people starve. They can let people use their health care. They can let students not get their scholarship money and pay for everything that's important. But ICE is still getting paid. In fact, Kristi Noem said that ICE is going to get a super check on October 22nd that will give them back pay and pay them for the next pay period. So we don't just know that Trump is an authoritarian. We know what his priorities are. I want people to starve. I want people to suffer. I don't care if they starve and suffer. But if my secret police are still working and grabbing teenagers off the street with masks, I'm good with it.
They're also paying for a big recruitment ad that is now running all across this country. So they have some funds available. Here's what I cannot riddle out, and I will sort of start with the two once and future Republicans, which is if Donald Trump is not bothered, but congressional Republicans, we know from reporting, are to varying degrees realizing this is going to be a political liability for them. They are spending a lot of time in their districts because Speaker Johnson has sent them to their districts so that they don't have to walk around Capitol Hill not doing anything. All the action's on their side. Like, they have to figure this out amongst themselves. What has to happen that Donald Trump actually starts listening to congressional Republicans on this specific question?
Sarah?
How dare you? How dare you do that to her?
That's called the pivot.
I don't think that he has a problem with this dragging out for as long as it will be. Because, look, Russ Vought and him want to purge the federal workforce of as many workers as possible. And this gives them the opportunity to do so. And we're seeing them take advantage of it. So I think he thinks that there isn't going to be as much political pain when it comes to himself being held accountable. And Donald Trump has never cared about the benefit of the Republican Party, let's be honest. So he doesn't care how this is going to affect the other congressional Republicans out there and how this could be a liability for them come the 2026 midterms. And when we get to issues like health care, even though that is something that we know are very concerned about because that's an issue that Democrats typically poll better on with voters. And so it's smart for Democrats to be centering their messaging around health care. And I think, though, that Trump thinks that they are going to win this fight if they just continue to dig their heels in. But right now, it seems like Democrats slightly have the upper hand when it comes to who the public is going to rest the blame on because, look, they're not the ones in power. And so that's what Democrats need to do is keep talking about health care and keep putting the blame on this administration and the Republicans in Congress because they're the ones who hold all the power right now.
I think that's right. And I think in large measure, Alicia, to the question about how Republicans, how nervous they are, they're damn nervous. They're really concerned about what their prospects look like going into next year. They know what their internal polling is showing them. They know what their buddies on the Hill on the other side of the aisle saying to them, and particularly in those districts where they could run a little blue, they could run a little bit red, and you have a chance to pick up some seats. You're not picking up those seats now. And so it becomes a real challenge for them. And the reality for them, Jason, is simply this. To your point, Donald Trump doesn't care.
No.
And Donald Trump is like, well, look, I'm trying to fix the 26 election so you don't have to worry about your seat. I'm going to get that all worked out. You ain't got to worry about your seat. But here's where I think Democrats have, to Sarah's point, an even stronger cudgel to use. And that is what the American people are starting to experience now. Simone and Lisa and I were talking in the last a couple of segments about the impact all of this stuff, the Comey stuff, the retribution, all these things are starting to settle down on the American people like a weight they should not have to carry.
Yes.
How do you see that narratively becoming a stronger argument in addition to health care? Right? For the Democrats to make going into next year, because they can be a little sloppy at times on messaging, but I have to give them kudos.
That's right, give them some kudos.
It's because Simone keeps telling me I have to give them some kudos.
Or
right?
Baby Ruth or whatever. Some candy that we desperately need.
Right. No, but they've done an incredibly good job to the point that the Speaker of the House looks like a blah, 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 blah when he's having to talk about these issues on national programs.
So it's going to hurt Republicans now. We're going to see it in Virginia. Winsome Sears is going to lose. Jay Jones might even be able to squeak by if there's enough of a wave. Maybe.
David, his text messages was crazy.
It's true, but I mean, enough of a wave. But what I always say is this, with midterms or presidential elections, right, the decision tends to be made, barring something strange, about a year in advance, right? Thanksgiving, Christmas time. If this goes until Thanksgiving and we start seeing those lines as people are trying to travel during the holidays, and everyone's going to be remembered that these TSA agents, and by the way, every time I've gone to an airport in the last couple of weeks, I'm like, thank you so much. Thank you so much. I'm really, really kind to everybody. That is where it's going to absolutely lock in. People are going to be financially destitute heading into the holiday season. They're not going to be able to travel. They're going to be angry. And the Republicans don't have an answer. Now, the Democrats, their answer, quite frankly, I think they should be more aggressive at this point. Yesterday's price ain't today's price. I would ask for more than just health care subsidies. Why not? If the Republicans are going to shoot themselves in the foot, ask for everything that you want. Closed mouths don't get fed. But at least for now, the idea of these guys are shutting down the government, still paying for ICE, but don't care about your health care, I think that's a solid message to run to 2026.
There's reporting that people are starting to ask questions about this across the country, in the states, like just are they going to get their Social Security checks? We know some checks, some offices, Social Security offices are closing. We were just talking, there are 28 Republican districts that are affected by these funding cuts that, or these project stoppages that Russell Vogt did. 6 of those districts are Republican frontliners. They say that they're just targeting Democrats with this hurt, but that's not the case, Sarah. And when they stop a project like the Army Corps of Engineers is working on real things. Like in Baltimore, it could mean port infrastructure. I think we all use the port, regardless of who we voted for at the last election.
Exactly. And that just goes to show how Donald Trump doesn't care about his own voters and supporters, because they are the ones who are being affected most by this shutdown. They are also the ones who are going to be most affected if the ACA subsidies are not extended. And so he doesn't care about bettering their lives. It's always all been about him. And he doesn't understand what it means to miss a paycheck, to not be able to keep the lights on. And it just goes to show that he is not a man of the people. He's only about himself.
But he does not know what it feels
not
like
to pay a bill. So.
Jason Johnson, well, he does know what it is not to pay a bill, honey. He hasn't paid a lot of them. Jason Johnson, and there's documentation for that. Sarah Matthews, thank you very much.
And we begin tonight with the massive No Kings protests that took place all over the country and the world this weekend. Organizers say that nearly 7 million marchers turned out in big cities and small towns to protest Donald Trump and his policies. And notably, the protests were peaceful. The NYPD said over 100,000 people gathered in New York City alone without a single arrest. In San Francisco, Americans used their own bodies to spell out the message of the day: No Kings. And while Trump did his best to downplay and undermine the event, protesters were prepared to speak for themselves.
I think it's a joke.
We live by the Constitution.
I guess it was paid for by Soros and other radical left lunatics.
No one paid me to be here. My rage is free and well deserved.
The demonstrations were very small.
There's over 2,000 of these things going on, right, across the country. Yeah. I think it's going to be bigger than 5 million.
The people were whacked out. Those are not representative of the people of our country.
I was willing to die and lost a leg in a foreign country fighting for their rights. There's no way I'm bending the only knee I have left for a king here in America.
By the way, I'm not a king.
Trump's claim that he doesn't see himself as a king may be contradicted by his actions. Over the weekend, he reposted 2 different AI-generated videos that depicted him as a king. Now, of course, the president's authoritarian ambitions go beyond AI social media. His immigration crackdown is at the heart of the protests against him, and it continues to alarm experts. ProPublica reports, quote, current and former national security officials describe the legions of mass immigration officers operating in near total anonymity on the orders of the president as an unfettered and unaccountable national police force. Trump is also claiming that he has, quote, unquestioned power under the Insurrection Act to deploy troops anywhere he wants. And his next target appears to be San Francisco, California. I should note that as a matter of law, that claim of unprecedented power is false. But just hours ago, 2 Trump-appointed judges on the United States Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit ruled that the president can deploy the National Guard to the streets of Portland. This overturns a lower court's restraining order. All of this despite the fact that most of Trump's claims of unfettered power have actually been rebuffed by other courts, and his monarchical ambitions are being rejected by millions of Americans in the streets. Joining me now to discuss all of this and kick it off tonight is David Litt, former speechwriter for President Obama, and Molly Jong-Fast, special correspondent for Vanity Fair and contributing opinion writer with the New York Times. All right, David, can we talk about this Ninth Circuit ruling? This one's unusual because usually the courts have pushed back, at least the lower courts have pushed back, and certainly on the claims of power to deploy troops to American cities for ICE enforcement, or in some cases, what looks like more federalized domestic law enforcement. What's your take on what this means, given what we saw this weekend?
Well, Melissa, first of all, thank you for having me on. And I'm also aware you know a lot more about the law than I do, but I'm going to offer a broader view, which is the Ninth Circuit used to be historically liberal. And part of what we are seeing and part of what Democrats were warning about in the last Trump term was this takeover of the courts. Right? Trump and his allies boasted about flipping the courts. This is what happens when you have these flipped partisan-packed courts.
Well, so this is actually an opinion where 2 of the judges, the 2 in the majority, were actually Trump appointees, and there's one judge, a longtime Ninth Circuit judge, Susan Graber, who has dissented from this ruling.
Right, and I think, I don't mean to say that every Trump judge will always support Trump. We have seen a lot of Trump-appointed judges reject the president's, as you put it, monarchical ambitions. But at the same time, I think that one of the things that Democrats, all of us worried about Trump's king-like agenda, need to be keeping our eye on is also not just what's happening now, but the continued attempt to pack the courts over the next couple of years. It's one of the reasons the Senate is going to be so important in the midterms. We have to put a stop to some of these nominations.
All right, so this Ninth Circuit ruling, Molly, is actually very interesting because it focuses on the president's claim that he needs to be able to protect an ICE facility in Portland, Oregon. We saw the protests over the weekend. We saw protests earlier in Portland. A lot of frogs. Doesn't seem to be a lot of violence. What do you make of this idea that the National Guard is needed because the protests are out of control and are basically endangering public safety?
So this is one of the problems that Trump has had this whole time, and he's had it with the No Kings protest, right? Like, you saw them nervous before it happened. You saw the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, being like, no checks, no kings. Like, if they were like, Democrats want to keep the government closed for the No Kings rally. I don't even know what that would have to do with anything. But there was like a lot of anxiety about it. And I think the fact that it ended up being 7 million people, and maybe even a little more, there's some estimations that it might be more, and that they were peaceful and that they were not radical and that they were people talking about just the Constitution. Like, you can't get more. You know, that's what we're all here for. So I think that was problematic for them. And you even saw they couldn't figure out how to message it. And this White House very good at messaging. And all of a sudden you saw Trump saying they're radicals. And then you saw someone else saying they're all old. And someone else said they were all white. I mean, okay, like, you know, that none of those are disqualifying. And so I do think this has rattled them. And then you put that with those polls that show him underwater on everything. And look, you know, even if you want to rule as a king, you still got to get a buy-in from the people.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about how rattled they might have been this weekend. I know I was rattled by some of those AI videos that the president posted. I don't think I'd ever seen anything quite like that. I hope never to see anything quite like that again. But what do you make that the president first started out saying, like, this was just an anti-American demonstration, which, as Molly says, was belied by the fact that they literally transported the Constitution down the streets in some cases. And these were grandmas and veterans and everyone coming out. Why then the pivot to this AI-generated video of the president in a cockpit with a crown on doing all kinds of things?
Well, first of all, if you're hoping to never see videos like this again, I think your hopes are going to be not achieved. I'm sorry to say. They seem to be all in on this AI slop.
Everywhere.
Yeah.
Okay.
But I think part of the reason, right, they're never going to say, oops, we were wrong. That's just not how the Trump administration operates. You will see them flail. And I think this is AI flailing. And part of that is, as you're saying, this was not just peaceful, it was patriotic. I was at a No Kings protest in Red Bank, New Jersey. So it was not huge, it wasn't a big city. It was like a celebration of
the liberal bastion of New Jersey.
Right, I mean, and the other piece of that is, you know, I think about this is a president who described January 6th as a day of love and tried to say that No Kings was a day of hate. And I thought it was funny because after the January 6th protest, they stormed the Capitol, and after the No Kings protest I went to, we all got Italian ice, right? It was like, this is just, if we were terrorists, we were not very terrifying. And I think that meant that the Trump administration, which would have loved some violence or something to point to, they were left with nothing. So they typed something into ChatGPT and tried to do their best.
Yeah. Not sure they succeeded in doing their best. Maybe not the best people, maybe not the best AI. But Molly, I want to play you a little bit more from many of the people who turned out this weekend. Let's take a look.
Everything this regime has been up to is anti-American.
We've got another election in just a year from now, which is the midterms. And we could actually change the House and the Senate with the midterms.
Congress makes the laws, not the president.
All right, let's think about that point. Congress makes the laws, not the president. Where is Congress right now? Do you think Congress will be bestirred after all of this to get back in the driver's seat and maybe exercise some of its prerogatives that it has thus far ceded to this president?
Congress is on vacation, right? Mike Johnson sent them home again. If you look at their calendar, it is stunning.
Yeah.
And he's keeping them out for any number of reasons. He does not want to swear in the newest member of Congress, the 151st signature on the discharge petition for the Jeffrey Epstein files, which, again, you know, he's making that such a thing, which ultimately this administration is never going to release the files. But OK, I do think we're seeing a lot of there's like I think they have to do popular stuff, even if they want to be autocrats. They still need some buy-in from the voters, and they're not getting that. And remember, like, Trump is not on the ticket again. Whatever they say, he's constitutionally not able to run again. I mean, he may try and they may do something, but at this point, the people who are on the ticket in 2026 are on vacation. So, like, those guys, you know, even though they're trying to, like, re-gerrymander so that he doesn't lose, you know, if you re-gerrymander enough, you dummy-mander. And if there's enough of a Democratic wave, then a lot of these Republicans who think they have safe seats may not.
Right. So, David, let's talk about something Molly just said. This prospect that the president is term limited. The 22nd Amendment says he is term limited at 2 terms, but he has been floating on some of this AI-generated social media this weekend that maybe he'll stick around until the year 90,000. Like, it beggars belief. But What do you think? Is he merely floating this? Is he just being hyperbolic? Or is this a way of testing the waters?
I think Trump is always testing the waters, right? The limiting factor in the Trump administration is what can we get away with?
Right.
And so often there's this kind of ironic way of starting out, right? It's just a joke. You know, it's tongue in cheek. We're all in on it. That's how, you know, not respecting the results of the 2020 election started in some ways. Trump sort of said, oh, well, if I win, and is he joking? Is he not joking? Well, we found out he wasn't joking. But maybe he found that out too, right? You just kind of keep pushing and pushing and pushing. I do think one of the things that struck me is even among people who I know, and also, you know, when you've seen polling on it, people who support Trump, many of them are like, a third term? No, that's not how America works, right? You don't have to be like a deep lover of American civics to be like, no, 2 terms, that's the thing.
You just have to read
Right.
in the Constitution.
It's like, it's very basic, and people are used to that. So that idea, it might be fine in again, another piece of AI content. I do think that if he ever tried it, especially if, as Molly said, he's this underwater, I don't think that he's going to find it as easy as he might think.
He is also the oldest person to ever be elected president. I'm just saying. I know
Where
we're not
have we heard
allowed,
that before?
Right, I know we're not allowed to talk about his age because that's only for Biden, but he is actually quite old.